This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. Natalie Hastings. Natalie and her fiancé Paul were out in Hemel Hempstead, a commuter town 24 miles northwest of London. It was just after midnight on the 15th of January 2018. They'd enjoyed themselves that night and they were happy just walking back through town towards where Paul lived in the old town district of Hemel Hempstead. There were still a few people milling about, even at this early hour, and Paul actually saw a couple of people that he knew, and so he stopped to talk to them, and Natalie carried on ahead. She had to draw out some money, so she went round the corner and towards the cash point. A Volvo XC90 turned down that road, and there was someone in the driver's seat and a passenger on the other side. The car stopped for a moment before turning and driving towards Natalie's direction. At this point, Natalie glanced up from the cash machine that she was at and she recognised the car. She realised who it was, she knew who was inside, and so, unalarmed, she went back to what she was doing and typed her PIN in at the ATM. The vehicle began revving its engine, but Natalie continued to type her PIN in and get the money out. And then there was the sound of a metal on concrete thud, and it soon became clear that the car had actually mounted the pavement. It increased its speed, and by now it was coming right towards her. She stood still at first, not really knowing what to do, sort of shocked and unsure at what she should do. And then she realised that the vehicle was coming right for her, and so she started to run. Out of the open window of the driver's side of that vehicle, the man inside started to shout towards her. He shouted, "You're dead, you're dead, you're dead," and then continued to increase the speed and drive towards her. The bonnet was just inches away from her, but just as it was about to mow her down, she managed to actually jump out of the way of the car, and she fell onto the pavement and twisted one of her ankles, but she managed to avoid getting hit by that car. She was still partially standing at this point, and she managed to steady herself, and then she started moving in the opposite direction, again trying to get away from the car. The vehicle then came to a sudden stop just a few meters away from her. No one got out of the car, it just stayed still and the man stayed inside. The engine was still running, and at this point, Natalie decided to try and reason with the driver. She needed to make him realise that he didn't need to do this. And so she said, quote, "I haven't done anything." And she realised that she needed help. So in this moment, she called out her fiancé's name. She shouted for Paul. And remember that Paul's not too far away. He's just around the corner, but he is out of sight. So he hasn't seen any of this going on. But as she started to call his name, he did begin to hear her, and so he started to make his way away from his friends and towards a shouting Natalie. At the same time as this was happening, the driver of the Volvo accelerated and moved swiftly away from Natalie. But he then turned the car around, speeding across the central reservation of a zebra crossing, and he turned that car around so that it was once again facing Natalie head on. And while this was happening, Natalie had seen what was about to happen. She knew that the car was coming for her, and so she'd started to run as fast as she could across the street and past some of the shops in the town centre. The driver revved the engine, put his foot down and hurtled towards Natalie. She was still running and she had her back towards the Volvo, but she couldn't outmatch the speed, and so although she was running, the car got closer and closer until it did hit her. Natalie went down onto the floor and then the car went over her. The car kept going, and it was going at such speed that it actually went over Natalie's body and towards a set of shop windows where it smashed into them and came to a standstill. The whole front of these shops and office buildings was completely smashed up. The car was in it, there were alarms sounding, but Natalie was still on the floor, and by way of a miracle, she was still alive. She was trying to push herself up, but all the time she was getting weaker and weaker, and eventually she started to lose consciousness. As she did so, she could see her fiancé Paul running towards her, and he was getting closer and closer, but he also saw the driver of the Volvo get out of the car. The driver had to put his hands on the side of the car to pull himself out, and as he did so, he actually reached down and pulled off his prosthetic leg, and he started waving it about, trying to ward off people who were trying to come and help Natalie. The passenger who had been in the same car had by this point got out of the car And he was in complete disbelief at what had happened. And then one of the onlookers ran towards the car and shouted, quote, "Did you hit her? Did you run her down?" The driver shouted back, quote, "Yes, I effing did." Then, as the chaos continued around Natalie, the driver reached into the glove box of his car and he pulled out a small package. The small package was in a fat white envelope and he put that package into his pocket. It was full of crack cocaine. He then reached down and reattached his prosthetic leg and sat back and just watched as the chaos ensued. As Paul managed to reach Natalie, she did manage to say, "He hit me, he hit me." She then slumped back onto the pavement, and Paul at this point was unsure if Natalie was unconscious or if she was dead, and he turned to the driver of the Volvo and he said, "You effing killed her." And then the driver just began to laugh. Hertfordshire Constabulary were called at 12:12 a.m. on Monday the 18th of January 2018 to reports of a collision in the Queensway area. Paramedics arrived pretty quickly and they made an assessment of Natalie's condition before transporting her to the hospital. Her condition was extremely serious and treatment was started immediately. It was unbelievable to the witnesses at the scene that Natalie hadn't died immediately. It was quite a miracle that she was alive, but the prospects at the hospital didn't look good. Police were attending and they were trying to get a sense of what had happened and why this person had seemingly out of nowhere mowed Natalie down and attempted to kill her. And Paul knew as soon as he had seen that man get out of the car who he was and why he had tried to kill Natalie. Paul had known the driver of the car for 40 years and Natalie had known him for around 20 years. His name was Simon Whittle, and Paul knew that Simon had a pretty nasty drug habit. It was a drug habit that would cost him sometimes over £2,000 a day. Simon had been living with Paul until about 2 weeks before the incident, and that was because Simon had found himself out on the street and that he needed somewhere to live, and Paul had offered him to stay at his house. At first, it was fine with Simon and Paul coming and going from the flat whenever they wanted, but things quickly started to deteriorate, with Simon beginning to bring people back to the flat at all times of the night and day, and people that Paul certainly didn't know, and even people that Simon didn't know very well. And about 2 weeks before the attack on Natalie, Simon had brought 2 men back to the flat that neither Paul or Natalie had known. And during their time there was a number of other people at the flat, and the 2 men had grown quite aggressive and violent. Their behaviour grew more and more abusive as the night went on, and it actually ended up with one of those men drawing a knife on another person in the flat that night and demanding money. They were robbed at knife point, and when those 2 men had left, that's when Paul told Simon, quote, "Our friendship is falling apart." And he said that Simon would just have to leave. Simon did not like being told what to do. He did not like the fact that Paul had told him to leave, and he began to grow particularly bitter and resentful and vengeful, especially towards Natalie. And then one day following him being kicked out, he waited until he saw Natalie and Paul leave the flat for the day, and he actually went in. He still had his key. He went in and he completely smashed the flat up. He got hold of one of the tables, he threw it across the room and it splintered into a lot of pieces. He grabbed chairs, threw them over and really wrecked the flat. And when Paul returned home, he knew immediately who had done it, but he thought, okay, Simon's got his anger out. That's it, that'll be the end of it. But of course, that wasn't it. Other than a couple of times when Simon and Paul had passed each other on the street and tried to sort of ignore each other, they hadn't had any contact since then. Until Simon had run Natalie over with his car. The police immediately arrested Simon and they brought him into custody and they started questioning him. They also tested him for drugs and they found that he had 800 milligrams of a cocaine derivative per litre of blood. And it didn't really matter how much Simon denied what had happened that night because there were so many witnesses, so many eyewitnesses who were around. From the witness statements, it seemed a pretty open and shut case. Although the officers knew what had happened, they didn't exactly know why. Simon, though, was going to do everything he could to avoid a murder charge, and so he claimed that when he'd first hit Natalie, it had just been because he was struggling with his passenger inside the car, and that led to him losing control and then eventually hitting Natalie. None of the witness statements made this plausible, and the police did actually manage to eventually interview Simon's passenger. When that had happened, when the event had happened, Simon's passenger had panicked and he had fled the scene immediately. He'd called his girlfriend at the time and got himself picked up. But as the enormity of what had happened started to sink in, he realised he needed to go back and tell the police what had happened. So around 20 minutes after that, he got his girlfriend to drop him off at the police station, and he gave a statement there and then. He told the police and later on the prosecution that there was nothing that he did inside that car that would have made Simon hit that woman. Whilst Simon was doing everything he could to try and shift the blame away from himself, Natalie was lying in intensive care fighting for her life. And as for Simon, with his first claim being completely denied by all of the witnesses and his passenger, he realised he needed to change his story. He now said that he had swerved in order to avoid hitting a fox in the road. But of course, that didn't make sense given the route that Simon had taken when he'd hit Natalie, and so police quickly dismissed that claim. Simon then changed his story again, this time saying that he wasn't even in the car. He said that someone else had been driving, and obviously the police again dismissed this claim. Having run out of excuses and the real version of events being extremely clear given the evidence, Simon became angry and he actually removed his prosthetic leg and he started hurling it around, trying to attack police officers with it. Then he started to kick at the wheelchair that had been given to help him get about during his time in detention. And then he lost his temper and shouted, quote, "I ran the effing bitch over." And after all that, all he would say when police continued to question him was no comment. By now, Natalie's condition was critical, and despite doctors doing everything they could to save her, Natalie eventually died on Tuesday the 16th from multiple organ failure due to multiple pelvic injuries. She was just 41 years old. Simon was charged with murder, and he was also charged with assaulting a police officer because of what he'd done within his custody time. The destroyed office from where Simon had carried out his brutal attack on Natalie was boarded up over the following few days, and family and friends came and put flowers down and messages to Natalie, speaking of their heartbreak and the utter devastation of this tragedy. During the trial, the prosecutor described Simon as dishonest, saying that he lied about his passenger's actions. Quote, "He later claimed in an interview that somebody else had been driving the car. That is desperate stuff from a man with no real defence. Simon used the car as his weapon and killed Natalie as surely as if he'd taken a gun and shot her or taken a knife and stabbed her." For whatever reason, Simon had taken exception to his eviction and relations between him, Paul Stanley and Natalie Hastings. All his defence were able to do was to say that Simon's passenger had potentially distracted him inside the car, and to say that that passenger was a drug user and so was unreliable. They suggested that Paul and Natalie had been involved in selling drugs for Simon 2 weeks before the murder. But it didn't matter. Jurors were shown that harrowing CCTV footage of Simon driving the car into Natalie, and it was easy for them to find him guilty of murdering Natalie Hastings. On sentencing, the judge said, quote, "On the clearest of evidence, you carried out the brutal and merciless killing of Natalie Hastings. She was alone, and anyone who watched the CCTV could only feel sickness and revulsion. You pursued her. You made your intentions clear, not just by what you did as you hunted her down. You are, in my judgment, a callous and ruthless individual who will unleash extreme violence to anyone who crosses your path." He was told he must serve a minimum of 20 years in prison. Natalie's sister paid tribute to a sister she said had a heart of pure gold and whose love and laugh were infectious. She was an amazing daughter, sister, auntie and granddaughter. To the girl who always put others first, you'll be missed eternally, but your memory will always live on. We love you always and forever, your family. Thank you for watching this episode of Red Rum. Please give it a thumbs up. There's a back catalogue of over 50 episodes, so please take a look through those if you want some more viewing. and I will see you next week for another episode of Red Rum. Bye.